Hello, curious minds, and welcome to Documentary for Sleep. When we look at the natural world, violence is everywhere, but it is almost always simple. A lion hunts the zebra because it is hungry. A hawk dives because it must feed its young. Even when animals fight among themselves, it is usually to defend territory, to protect the pack, or to survive another day. Their cruelty, if we can even call it that, begins and ends with survival. But humans, we tell a different story. We are the species that paints caves with beauty, that builds cities out of stone, that can feel empathy for strangers across oceans. And yet, we are also the species that invents torture, that wages wars not only for food or land, but for pride, for power, or sometimes for no clear reason at all. Our violence does not always stop when the stomach is full or the territory is safe. It can grow, spread, and take on meanings animals never imagined. And so the question arises, what is it about us, about sapiens, that makes us capable of such extremes? Why can the same mind that creates poetry also create cruelty? Why do we cross lines that nature itself seems unwilling to cross? Whether you're lying in bed, trying to quiet your thoughts, or just letting this play softly in the background while you cook, study, or wind down, this is a space for slowing down and asking the deeper questions. Tonight, we're not wandering into fantasy, but into history, psychology, and anthropology, asking why sapiens, the storytelling ape, also became the creature capable of extraordinary kindness and extraordinary cruelty. And if you drift off while listening, that's perfectly fine. I've left timestamps in the description so you can return tomorrow. Now, if this kind of soft science and quiet exploration helps you relax, focus, or learn, consider liking and subscribing. It helps this channel reach more curious sapiens like you. And if you feel like sharing, tell us. Do you listen before sleep, during work, or maybe on a night shift far from home? And as always, stay curious, stay calm. In the profound darkness of a primeval forest, a gaze cuts through the gloom. It belongs not to a predator stalking prey, but to one of our own. This pair of eyes is not searching for a meal, but observing, calculating, waiting for the opportune moment to strike down the person standing beside them. This silent, invisible weapon, wielded long before the club or the spear, may be the very cradle of a uniquely human form of cruelty. We are born masters of the gaze. Deep within our neural architecture, a sophisticated system hums with silent activity. The visual cortex and the amygdala fire in concert, creating an exquisite sensitivity to the direction and nuance of another's eyes. This is not merely about sight. It is a biological radar for intention. We can discern a flicker of fear, a shadow of deception, or the cold glint of malice long before a word is spoken or a hand is raised. This primal skill forms the bedrock of complex social strategy, of alliances forged and broken with a glance. It allows us to predict, to manipulate, to survive in a world of our own kind. But if this tool was forged for cooperation, why does it feel so perfectly honed for betrayal? What does it mean that our brains are wired not just to see, but to be seen, and to interpret the silent language of another's eyes as a matter of life and death? This ancient conversation of glances echoes from the walls of time itself. In the deep, sacred silence of caves like Lascaux and Chauvet, where torchlight once danced on damp stone, our ancestors left behind a haunting legacy. Among the majestic aurochs and charging bison, they painted eyes, human eyes, animal eyes staring out from the rock with an unnerving permanence. These were not mere illustrations, they were a testament to a world where every glance carried weight. In the brutal calculus of prehistoric life, to correctly read the gaze of a rival, a potential mate, or a stranger, was the difference between perpetuating your lineage and becoming a forgotten skeleton in the dark. The ability to project dominance, to feign submission, or to coordinate an ambush without a sound, it all began here, in the meeting of eyes across the firelight. Was this the moment the gaze transformed from a simple signal into a strategic instrument, laying the groundwork for something far more sinister than competition for resources? This legacy of the watchful eye did not fade with the advent of civilization, it merely found new arenas. We still engage in silent duels of stares in crowded subway cars and tense boardrooms, a subconscious reenactment of those ancient power struggles. The modern world has even weaponized this instinct. In the sterile, terrifying rooms of psychological interrogation, a sustained, unblinking gaze is a recognized tool of torture, a way to dismantle a person's psyche without laying a finger. Soldiers are trained in its use, to break the will of an enemy through the sheer, oppressive force of a look. The club in the hand is a crude tool. The club of the gaze is infinitely more refined and psychologically devastating. So, have we simply polished this ancient stone tool into a scalpel, using the same neural pathways for empathy to enact a more precise form of control? Yet, to see the gaze only as a weapon is to ignore its other, gentler face. Is it not also the primary channel for a mother's boundless love, as she locks eyes with her newborn, forging a bond stronger than steel? Is it not the silent language of shared joy between friends, or the profound comfort of a sympathetic look that says, "I understand," without uttering a word? In the trusting eyes of a child, we see the purest form of this connection, untainted by calculation. This is the great paradox of our nature. The very same organ that can project lethal intent can also radiate the deepest compassion. Does this duality mean our capacity for cruelty is merely a perversion of our capacity for love, two sides of the same, deeply social coin? So, what happens when the eyes, those windows to the soul, become fortifications? The journey into human brutality does not begin with a sharpened flint or a bloodied fist. It begins in that cold, assessing look that strips away humanity and sees only an obstacle or a threat. It opens the door to an era where violence between humans is no longer just about survival, but about something far more abstract and chilling. If a simple look can be the first step onto that dark path, then what story is written in the silent, unhealed fractures of an ancient skull, where the final, brutal argument was made not with a glance, but with a stone? The skull is a cradle of thought, a fortress for the mind. Yet, sometimes, it becomes a testament to a final, shattering truth. Imagine a single cranium, lifted from the deep earth of Cima de los Huesos, the pit of bones. It is heavy with age, nearly 500,000 years old, and upon its brow, two symmetrical fractures, a mirror image of violence. This was no accidental fall, no desperate scramble with a predator. The force required, the precise location, the identical nature of the blows they whisper a chilling story across the millennia. This was an act of intention, a murder. This act, preserved in calcium and stone, points to a profound shift within the evolving human brain. Deep within the neural labyrinth, regions dedicated to foresight and strategy blossomed. This was the birth of a new kind of calculus, the ability to run scenarios, to plan for a future that had not yet happened. An animal acts on impulse, a surge of adrenaline in a fight for survival, but to kill with purpose, to see the death of another, not as a momentary struggle, but as a solution to a problem. This requires a cold, deliberate fire. It is a brutality that transcends the raw, biological instinct of the predator. It is a cruelty sculpted by thought. Does the capacity for complex planning, our greatest evolutionary gift, inherently carry the blueprint for its own weaponization? The evidence is not confined to a single, ancient grave. Cranium 17 from Cima de los Huesos stands as one of the earliest suspected hominid murders. But then, we journey to the shores of a prehistoric lake in Nataruk, Kenya. Here, time has frozen a nightmare. The remains of 27 men, women, and children lie where they fell, a community obliterated. Their bones tell a stark, unforgiving story. Hands bound by sinew, skulls crushed by blunt force, stone projectiles embedded in skeletons. This was not a personal feud that spiraled out of control. This was coordinated, efficient, and merciless. It was a massacre. The leap from a lone act of violence to the systematic eradication of a group suggests a terrifying social evolution. When did the first mind conceive of the idea that an entire community of others could, or should, be erased? The echoes of those fractured skulls resonate in the stark headlines of our modern world. The terrorist who meticulously plans an attack, the school shooter who maps out their assault, the architect of a genocide who rationalizes mass death in ledgers and meetings, their actions are not born of a sudden, uncontrollable rage. They are the product of cold, deliberate planning. The tools have changed from sharpened stone to high-velocity rifles, but the cognitive architecture remains eerily familiar. The violence is reasoned, justified, within the twisted logic of the perpetrator's mind. Have we simply learned to clothe our ancient brutality in the sophisticated language of ideology and grievance? One might cling to a hopeful thought. Perhaps these archaeological snapshots are preserved precisely because they were aberrations, shocking exceptions that scarred the collective memory so deeply they were laid down in the geological record. Maybe for every Nataruk, there were millennia of peace that left no trace, their quiet stories dissolved by wind and water. Could it be that cooperation, not conflict, was the true norm, and these bones are merely the rare, grim fossils of that norm breaking down? But the accumulating evidence from pits and lakebeds across the world whispers a more unsettling truth. The violence was not rare. It was organized, and it began very, very early. This forces a question that is far more discomforting than asking why we kill. We know why we kill: for resources, for fear, for power. The more profound, more haunting question is how. How does the human mind, capable of such profound love and breathtaking art, so effortlessly construct a rationale for the annihilation of its own kind? What alchemy of fear, identity, or belief allows a conscious being to systematically switch off empathy and plan the death of another? And if such planned violence is an old story, then what other forms did it take? When the act was complete, and the bodies lay still, what did the killers tell themselves in the silence that followed? Did they feel shame, or did they feel purpose? Perhaps the story does not end with the broken bone, but only begins there. What if the blood was not just spilled, but offered? The skull is heavy in the hands, a dome of bone that once housed a universe of thought and dream. The cut is clean, precise, running along the brow line, a deliberate act performed not in frenzy, but with a chilling, calculated care. There are no tooth marks, no signs of butchery for meat. This was not a meal. This was a message. The skeleton, unearthed from the deep past, presents a paradox that echoes through millennia. Can brutality be cloaked in the sacred? Can the act of killing be transformed, through ritual, into something holy? Our minds are wired for meaning. Deep within the neural tapestry, there is a nexus where raw emotion fuses with abstract symbol. This is the cradle of ritual. When death is entwined with the mysterious, when a life is taken not for mere survival, but for a concept, a god, a harvest, a fantasy, the brain's ancient circuitry blurs the line. The adrenaline of the hunt, the visceral thrill of the predator, is channeled into a new form. The same hand that can caress a child can wield the sacrificial blade, and the mind, in its quest for order, may not register the contradiction. It sees only the ceremony, the solemn duty, the connection to something larger than itself. Is the capacity for reverence, then, the very thing that enables our most organized forms of violence? The evidence is etched in bone. At Krapina, in the hills of Croatia, Neanderthals gathered around the remains of their own. The cuts on those ancient skulls were not made to access marrow or brain. They were a post-mortem ritual, perhaps to release the spirit, to honor the dead, or to craft a grisly trophy that symbolized power over a rival's essence. Centuries later, and an ocean away, the Aztecs perfected this art of sacred violence. Their times Tezonpantli asterisk, towering racks of skulls, were not mere displays of terror. They were acts of devotion. Each skull, meticulously prepared and displayed, was an offering to the gods, a plea for the sun to rise again. The act of killing was embedded in a cosmic narrative, a necessary transaction to sustain the world. The violence was not sanitized, it was sanctified. Does dressing death in the garments of the divine make it more or less human? This thread, woven from our deepest past, runs unbroken into the present. The public executions of medieval town squares were grand spectacles, complete with sermons, last rites, and a carnival atmosphere. The modern state, having monopolized violence, conducts its killings behind sterile walls, with lethal injections and precise protocols. We have replaced the drumbeat with the hum of machinery, the chanting crowd with a handful of official witnesses, yet the ritual remains the last meal, the final statement, the chaplain's prayer. We have constructed elaborate procedures to disguise the fundamental act, organized killing. In the fervor of an extremist cult, this transformation is complete. Murder becomes martyrdom, a sacred duty in a holy war. Are these rituals a way to manage our collective horror of death, or are they a sophisticated mechanism to permit what our primal instincts might otherwise reject? Perhaps, then, ritual is not a mask for cruelty, but a coping mechanism for a creature aware of its own mortality. It is a way to impose narrative on the chaos of death, to find purpose in the seemingly random snuffing out of a life. The act may be born from a deep, spiritual need to commune with forces beyond our control, to offer something precious to appease the indifferent universe. The violence, in this light, is not the point. It is the terrible, tragic cost of the connection. Is the true nature of these acts one of brutality or one of a desperate, flawed search for meaning? But when the ritual becomes a curtain, when the chant of the crowd drowns out the individual's final breath, we must pause. The line between a sacred offering and a sanctioned murder grows perilously thin. The same psychological machinery that allows us to build cathedrals can be harnessed to build gallows. We watch from a distance, believing ourselves civilized, evolved beyond the skull racks of our ancestors. Yet, the blood that once soaked the temple stones now flows through the sterile tubes of the execution chamber, and the crowd still gathers, if only in their minds. If the sacred can so easily be used to sanctify the slaughter, then what, truly, separates the altar from the abattoir? And if this dark seed is planted so deep within our nature, what does it say about the very origins of life, where the first and most intimate of bonds can also be the first to break? The new male lion, his mane still matted with the dust of recent battles, surveys his hard-won kingdom. The lionesses watch him, a tense silence hanging between them. Then, it begins. A low growl, a sudden charge. He is not targeting a rival, but the cubs, the living, breathing proof of the previous male's reign. One by one, the small, spotted bodies go still. To a human observer, it is an act of unspeakable cruelty. But in the cold calculus of the savannah, it is a simple, brutal equation. With her cubs gone, the lioness will cease lactating, her estrus cycle will restart, and she will be ready to carry the new king's genes. The old lineage is erased to make way for the new. This is infanticide, a behavior documented in 1/4 of all mammalian species. It is a strategy written in the language of evolutionary advantage, a stark reminder that the cradle of life is often shadowed by the club of competition. But what of our own species? We, who build cathedrals and write symphonies, who speak of unconditional love and the sacred bond of parent and child. Our history, too, is stained with the same dark act. A desperate mother in a prehistoric winter, leaving a newborn in the snow to ensure the survival of her other children. A priest in ancient Carthage, placing an infant into the bronze, outstretched arms of the god Baal, the child's cries swallowed by the roar of a sacrificial fire. Are these acts born of the same primal logic that drives the lion? Or does the human mind, with its tangled web of consciousness, culture, and creed, weave a more complex, and perhaps more terrifying, tapestry of motive? Where does instinct end and ideology begin? The first layer of this truth is written in our very blood and bone, in the relentless, impersonal engine of natural selection. For many animals, infanticide is a grimly efficient tool for genetic propagation. A male langur monkey taking over a troop, a male grizzly bear encountering a sow with cubs, their actions, though violent, serve a clear purpose: to eliminate the genetic investment of a competitor and swiftly bring the female back into a reproductive state. It is a strategy that maximizes the killer's own evolutionary fitness, a shortcut written into the DNA of survival. Resources, food, protection, maternal energy are finite. By removing offspring that do not carry his genes, the male redirects those precious resources toward his own future progeny. The individual life is sacrificed for the potential of the genetic line. It is a logic devoid of malice, a simple, if brutal, arithmetic of the wild. Yet, when we turn this lens upon ourselves, the clean lines of biological explanation blur into 1,000 shades of gray. Does a human father, drowning in debt and despair, see the face of a genetic rival in his crying child? Or does he see only an unendurable future, a mouth he cannot feed, a life of suffering he feels compelled to preempt? The biological imperative may form the deep, subterranean current, but it is filtered through the immense, complicated geology of the human mind. We possess the same primal drives, but we are cursed and blessed with the ability to rationalize them, to sanctify them, or to be shattered by them. The animal acts out of a clean, if cruel, logic. The human must then live with the aftermath, a ghost that haunts the space between the act and its justification. Can the cold equations of the gene ever truly explain the hot, messy reality of a human heart in conflict? To find an answer, we must dig, not into the genetic code, but into the layered earth, unearthing the artifacts of our own past. The ruins of Carthage offer not just dust and stone, but a chilling testament to the power of belief. Here, in a sophisticated, powerful empire, the charred bones of infants and young animals were placed carefully in burial urns, dedicated to the gods. This was not the rash act of a desperate individual, but a state-sanctioned, ritualized practice. It was, in the minds of its practitioners, a necessary offering, a transaction with the divine to ensure military victory, bountiful harvests, the very survival of the civilization. The violence was systematized, theologized. The child was not merely killed, it was given. Across the globe and throughout history, other forms of selective infraction emerged. In some hunter-gatherer societies, the birth of twins, or a child deemed malformed, or simply one too many for the tribe to support, could be a death sentence. The act was often swift, performed before the community could form a bond with the newborn. It was a pragmatic, if heartbreaking, form of population control, a cultural adaptation to harsh environmental limits. In these instances, the club was not wielded by a jealous male, but by the collective hand of tradition, by a worldview that subordinated the individual to the perceived needs of the many. The violence had been translated from a biological impulse into a social doctrine. When does a society's survival mechanism become its most profound moral failure? And what of our modern world, with its networks of laws and its language of human rights? The lion still stalks the savannah, and the ghost of Carthage still whispers in the shadows of our cities. The infanticide of today rarely wears the mask of ritual or the cold face of tribal pragmatism. It appears in the stark, clinical language of a police report, a young mother, isolated and terrified, suffocating her newborn in a dormitory bathroom. A father, consumed by postpartum depression, a affliction that can twist the deepest love into its most terrifying opposite, shaking a baby to silence its cries forever. A child, abandoned in a dumpster, a life discarded like refuse. These are not acts of genetic strategy or cultural doctrine. They are eruptions of profound psychological distress, the final, catastrophic failure of a mind under pressures it cannot bear. They are the products of poverty, of a support system that has crumbled into dust, of a mental illness left untreated in the shadows. The modern perpetrator is often not a monster, but a broken individual, a victim in their own right. Our society, for all its progress, has not eradicated the act. It has merely changed its costume. The violence has been internalized, transformed from a public ritual into a private hell. If the root cause has shifted from the survival of the gene to the collapse of the psyche, does that make the act more understandable, or in some ways, even more tragic? This forces us to confront a difficult, unsettling counterpoint. Is it possible that our rush to label these acts as pure evil blinds us to their complex, often heartbreaking origins? The mother in ancient times who exposed a child she knew would starve slowly, did she not believe she was sparing it a greater pain? The parent who, in the throes of a psychotic break, kills their child to save them from an imagined apocalypse, are they a murderer or a patient? The line between calculated cruelty and catastrophic breakdown is terrifyingly thin. What we see as an act of malice may, from another angle, be the distorted shape of a love that has snapped under an unbearable weight. Can we, in our judgment, truly separate the sin from the sickness, the choice from the circumstance? The journey from the lion's pride to the Carthaginian Tophet, to the silent, sterile horror of a modern-day tragedy, reveals a thread that connects the animal, the ancient, and the contemporary. It suggests that the capacity for this most intimate violence is a dark potentiality woven into the very fabric of life itself. It can be activated by the logic of genes, codified by the demands of culture, or triggered by the collapse of an individual mind. We have dressed it in different reasons across the millennia, but the act itself remains a chilling constant. So we are left, not with an answer, but with a deeper, more lingering question. If we, as a species capable of profound empathy and self-sacrifice, still carry this shadow within us, if we can so easily justify it to our gods, our tribes, or even to our own tormented selves, what does that say about the nature of our humanity? The lion feels no guilt. The Carthaginian priest believed he served a higher purpose. But we, in the silent aftermath, are left to stare into the abyss of our own nature, forced to wonder, is the greatest predator not the one that stalks the plains, but the one that resides in the terrifying, beautiful, and contradictory human heart? And if this darkness is so deeply embedded in our past, a legacy written in blood and bone, what other inheritances of violence might we still be carrying, waiting to be unleashed? The humid air of Gombe hangs thick, a living blanket of earth and decay. Sunlight struggles through the dense canopy, dappling the forest floor in shifting patterns of light and shadow. In this ancient theater, a drama unfolds that is as old as the hills themselves. A band of chimpanzee males moves with a quiet, focused intensity. Their target is not a gazelle or a stranger to the forest, but one of their own, a male from a rival group. The encounter is not a chaotic brawl, but a coordinated raid. They encircle, they strike, and within minutes, it is over. The victors drag the lifeless body away, their calls echoing through the trees before they melt back into the green, their daily routine resuming as if the fabric of their world had not just been torn by a thread of profound violence. To witness such an act is to look into a distorted mirror. We see ourselves, and yet we do not. This is not the random aggression of a solitary predator, but something far more chilling in its calculation. It is a strategic, collective violence, a deliberate dismantling of a rival. The chimpanzees, our closest genetic relatives, engage in what primatologists call lethal raiding, a cold, efficient process of patrolling territorial borders, assessing numerical advantages, and launching targeted attacks to eliminate individuals from neighboring communities. It is a brutal form of politics, where the currency is territory, resources, and genes. Within their DNA, and nestled within our own, lie the ancient blueprints for such behaviors. Genes that regulate aggression, territoriality, and the complex social hierarchies of primate life are part of our shared inheritance. The very neurotransmitters that course through our brains, dopamine, rewarding the successful coalition, serotonin, modulating our social anxieties and impulses, are the same chemical messengers that guide the actions of that troop in Gombe. The hardware for organized violence, it seems, was installed long before the first human walked upright. If such a capacity is woven into our very biology, a legacy from a common ancestor, what does that say about the quiet hum of potential that lies within our own societies? This legacy is not confined to the realm of genetics or the deep forest. The soil, that great keeper of secrets, has yielded its own grim testimony. At sites like Jebel Sahaba in Sudan, a cemetery from over 13,000 years ago tells a story written in bone. Among the skeletons, a significant number show the unmistakable marks of a violent end-stone projectile points embedded in bones, skulls fractured by blunt force. This was not a single, catastrophic event, but evidence of sustained, small-scale conflict. At Naturuk in Kenya, the remains of a hunter-gatherer group, men, women, and children, lie where they fell, preserved in the mud of a long-vanished lakeshore. They were ambushed, struck down, and left unburied. The pattern is hauntingly familiar. A group of individuals, identified as other, systematically attacked and killed. This is not the noble savage of romantic imagination, but a reflection of that same primate strategy, the formation of alliances to wage violence on the outgroup. The social architecture of our early ancestors, it appears, was built upon a foundation where coalitional aggression was not an aberration, but a viable, and perhaps effective, evolutionary strategy for survival and expansion. When the survival of your community is pitted against the resources of another, does the calculus of violence become not just possible but inevitable? And so we arrive in the modern world, with its sprawling cities and digital networks, its constitutions and its courts. Yet, beneath the thin veneer of civilization, the old machinery continues to whir. The same mental circuits that allowed a primate troop to distinguish us from them now power the engine of modern tribalism. The political partisan who dehumanizes their opponent, the nationalist who rallies against a foreign power, the online mob that descends upon a perceived outsider, all are operating on the ancient software of in-group divided by out-group psychology. This instinct to categorize, to bind tightly with our own, and to view the other with suspicion or outright hostility, is the bedrock upon which collective violence is built. In times of peace, it is a whisper. In times of conflict, it becomes a roar that can drown out reason and empathy. When our tribal identity is threatened, when the boundaries of our group feel permeable, does the leap from prejudice to violence become a terrifyingly short one? Yet, to see humanity as merely a more sophisticated chimpanzee is to miss the terrifying uniqueness of our condition. For the chimpanzee's violence, however brutal, remains contained. It is a tool for a specific purpose: territorial gain, resource control. It lacks a dimension we have perfected: cruelty. A chimpanzee does not build concentration camps. It does not devise systematic methods of torture. It does not create ideologies to justify the extermination of millions who share its own fundamental biology. This is the profound and disturbing paradox. Our superior intelligence, our capacity for abstract thought and symbolic language, did not simply allow us to transcend our violent heritage. It gave us the tools to refine it, to industrialize it, to elevate it into a form of art. The chimpanzee kills a rival. The human first dehumanizes him, constructs a philosophy around his eradication, and then meticulously plans his destruction, all while maintaining a moral self-image. Our cognitive leap granted us not just compassion, but a bottomless capacity for its opposite. So, if our basic instincts are a shared legacy with the chimpanzee, what monstrous alchemy does the human mind perform upon them? This question leads us inward, to the very architecture of the brain itself, to the ancient structures where fear and aggression are born. If the potential for both community and hostility is etched into our neural pathways, where exactly is the balance struck? Is our brain ultimately designed for connection or for conflict? The answer may lie deep within the temporal lobe, in a small, almond-shaped cluster of neurons called the amygdala, our primal sentinel, constantly scanning the environment for threats. Its size and reactivity vary from person to person, and these variations seem to whisper secrets about our fundamental disposition. A more reactive amygdala might mean a quicker trigger, a hair-trigger response to a perceived challenge, or a stranger's ambiguous glance. This is the neural substrate of the fight-or-flight instinct, the same instinct that propelled our ancestors and the chimpanzees of Gombe to defend their territory or preempt an attack. But here, the human story grows more complex, for we also possess a massive prefrontal cortex, the seat of reason, empathy, and impulse control. This modern edition is locked in a constant, silent dialogue with the ancient amygdala. It can soothe the primal fear, interpret the threat, or, disturbingly, it can be co-opted to justify it. It can take the amygdala's raw signal of danger, other, and weave an elaborate narrative of ideology and hate around it. So, is the amygdala the biological cradle of our tribalistic violence, the club we inherited from our primate past? Or is it merely a tool whose use is ultimately dictated by the higher mind that presides over it? Does the true source of our conflict lie not in the fear we feel, but in the stories we tell ourselves about who we should fear? The flicker lasts for less than a single heartbeat, a mere 30 milliseconds. A face, contorted by anger, flashes on a screen, too fast for the conscious mind to register. Yet, deep within the caverns of the brain, an ancient alarm screams. In the cool, magnetic tunnel of an MRI machine, the amygdala, a small, almond-shaped knot of neurons, ignites in a brilliant, furious red. This is the ghost in the machine, a reflex of fear that operates in the silent, subterranean world beneath thought. It is a response to a threat the thinking brain has not even seen, a primal echo in a modern skull. This is the bedrock upon which so much is built: our communities, our conflicts, our capacity for both protection and paranoia. Is this the very architecture of our social bonds, or is it a design flaw for hostility, etched into our biology by an unforgiving past? The amygdala is our sentinel, a biological watchtower perched in the limbic system. Its primary language is not reason, but raw sensation, fear, anxiety, a jolt of adrenaline that prepares the body to fight or flee. In humans, this region is remarkably developed, a complex and sprawling network compared to many other species. This sophistication grants us a dark gift, the ability to not just detect danger, but to amplify it, to weave narratives of threat from the barest threads of suspicion. It allows the heart to race and the muscles to tense before the cortex, the seat of logic, can even begin to ask for evidence. This neural shortcut was a lifesaver in a world of sudden predators, but in a world of subtle social cues, it becomes fertile ground for a distorted kind of violence, preemptive, defensive, and often tragically misplaced. If our most sophisticated, the threat detection system is also our most prolific producer of false alarms, what does that say about the very nature of the security it provides? To understand this paradox, we must journey back to a world without walls, where the rustle in the grass could be the wind or a rival clan. In the Pleistocene cradle of humanity, survival was a brutal calculus. Hesitation was a death sentence. The stranger was not a potential friend, but a vector of disease, a competitor for scarce resources, or a bearer of a club. In this context, a hair-trigger suspicion of outsiders was not a pathology. It was a prudent, evolutionarily honed tool. It was a cognitive bias that saved lives. Those who were quick to see a threat in a different face, a strange gesture, or an unfamiliar symbol were more likely to live to pass on their genes. The overly trusting, the ones who waited for proof of malicious intent, were often removed from the gene pool before they could plead their case. Their silence echoes in our DNA. Is our deepest-seated fear, then, not of death itself, but of the times, other times, who might cause it, a ghost story written in the language of natural selection? And so, we arrive in the modern world, a landscape utterly transformed, housing a brain that is not. The spears and predators are gone, replaced by headlines and social media feeds. But the amygdala does not know the difference. It cannot distinguish between a rival tribesman and a political opponent, between a physical assault and a cutting insult. The same neural pathways that once flared at the sight of a different painted face now ignite at the sight of a different colored jersey, a foreign accent, or a dissenting opinion. The rush of outrage on the internet, the swift categorization of people into us and them, the verbal violence and the social shunning, these may all be the modern, civilized costumes worn by an ancient, uncivilized instinct. We have built glass towers and digital networks, but we navigate them with a Stone Age mind. If our technology has created a global village, why does our neurology insist on building so many fences? A compelling counter-argument arises from within our own biology. We are not merely slaves to this almond-shaped fear center. we possess the prefrontal cortex, the seat of executive function, a late evolving marvel of wrinkled tissue that sits behind our foreheads. This is the chamber of deliberation, the voice of reason that can temper the amygdala's scream. It is the foundation of our ethics, our laws, our capacity for empathy and foresight. It allows us to recognize that the feeling of threat is not a command to act, but merely data to be considered. We can take a breath, we can choose compassion, we can override the impulse for retaliation. This, we tell ourselves, is what makes us human. This is our salvation from our own base nature. But if this rational brain is so powerful, why does it so often feel like a fragile dam holding back a torrent of primal emotion? Yet, if morality is merely a thin veneer, a delicate layer of civilization painted over a much older, more volatile core, then what happens when the environment conspires to peel it back? When media amplifies every outlier event into a tidal wave of danger, when political rhetoric paints entire groups of people as existential threats, when the constant hum of social anxiety wears down our cognitive reserves, the prefrontal cortex grows weary. It is an energy-intensive organ, and constant vigilance exhausts it. In its fatigue, the amygdala reclaims its throne. The ancient sentinel, once a protector, becomes a tyrant, seeing enemies in every shadow. The violence that follows feels righteous, defensive, necessary. It is not the eruption of a monster, but the quiet, chilling triumph of a system working exactly as it was designed to. So we are left to wonder, is our cruelty a fundamental flaw, or is it simply a safety mechanism triggered too easily in a world it was never meant to navigate? And if the battle between the ancient alarm and the modern mind is not fought on the plains of society, but in the very chemistry of our blood, what invisible forces tip the scales? What happens when the hormones of dominance and stress join the fray, turning our internal landscape into a battlefield where the outcome is anything but certain? The gavel falls. A life extinguished. In the cold, clinical aftermath, a blood test reveals a biological anomaly. The convicted killer had an abnormally high level of testosterone. The narrative seems to write itself, a hormone of violence, a chemical culprit. But then, consider another scene, one of roaring crowds and ecstatic triumph. A last-minute goal secures a victory, and in the veins of the celebrating fans, the same molecule surges. How can the very same substance be a thread connecting a courtroom monster and a jubilant sports enthusiast? This is not a story of a simple villain, but of a deep, ancient, and deeply misunderstood internal politics, a constant negotiation between two powerful forces within us. Testosterone. The word itself carries a certain weight, an aura of raw, untamed power. We often picture it as the engine of aggression, the fuel for a fight. But this is a profound oversimplification. Its true domain is far more nuanced. It is the chemical of ambition, of dominance, of the relentless pursuit of status. It doesn't simply make you want to hit someone, it makes you want to win, to climb, to be seen. It is the internal scorekeeper that celebrates a rise in the social hierarchy. When you win a game, close a deal, or even successfully argue a point, this molecule courses through you, a primal reward for a perceived victory. Its counterpart, cortisol, is the shadow to this light. It is the chemical signature of stress, of subordination, of threat. It is the feeling of being prey, the cold dread in the pit of your stomach before a confrontation. Modern endocrinology suggests that the balance between these two, the testosterone to cortisol ratio, is a more potent predictor of aggressive behavior than either alone. A high T divided by C ratio signifies an individual primed for challenge, one who perceives the world as a series of contests to be won, their internal chemistry tilted toward confrontation rather than submission. But is this hormonal calculus a command, or merely a permission slip? Does it light the fuse, or does it simply make the powder drier? To understand this internal tug-of-war, we must look back, far beyond the courtroom or the stadium, to the dust of our own origins. Archaeologists, in a feat of breathtaking ingenuity, have begun to read the hormonal histories locked in ancient bones and teeth. By analyzing fossilized remains, they have pieced together a startling evolutionary narrative. It appears that as Homo sapiens times evolved, as we began to form larger, more complex social groups, our baseline testosterone levels may have gradually decreased. This shift was not a weakening, but a social adaptation. Lower testosterone might have facilitated cooperation, tolerance, and the intricate social bonds necessary for building communities, for sharing food, for raising children collectively. The club was being set down, slowly, in favor of the cradle. Yet, this was not a linear march toward pacifism. The fossil record also hints at periods of intense turmoil, times of resource scarcity, of clashing tribes where the high testosterone phenotype, the individual more prone to explosive aggression and physical dominance, was selectively favored once more. In the chaos, the club was picked up again. Our biology, it seems, is not a fixed state but a dynamic pendulum, swinging between the peaceful architect and the formidable warrior in response to the world we build for ourselves. So, are we the architects of our society, or is our society the architect of our very chemistry? This ancient pendulum continues to swing within the polished halls of our modern world. The boardroom, the political debate, the digital arena of social media, these are our new savannas, our new battlegrounds, and the old hormones are still keeping score. A trader who orchestrates a ruthless takeover that costs thousands their jobs may experience the same testosterone surge as a conquering gladiator. A politician who demolishes an opponent in a debate, a troll who successfully shames a stranger online, their internal chemistry may reward these acts of social or psychological dominance with the same primal cocktail. The medium has changed, but the underlying metabolic transaction remains eerily similar. Cruelty, in its many modern forms, from a calculated layoff to a character assassination, can still be metabolically rewarded. Our institutions, for all their sophistication, have not freed us from this feedback loop. They have merely given it new languages, new weapons. We have civilized the world, but have we civilized the fundamental Zili-Jiger of our own bodies? And yet, a crucial counter-argument whispers from the quiet corners of this loud narrative. Consider the millions of individuals walking among us with naturally high testosterone levels who live lives of profound gentleness. The dedicated surgeon, whose steady hands require not aggression but immense control. The gentle giant, the peaceful leader, the quiet artist. They carry the same chemical potential as the aggressor, yet they channel it into creation, protection, or simple, steadfast calm. This undeniable truth forces a pivotal question. Are these hormones the dictators of our destiny, or are they merely the landscape upon which our character is built? They may lower the threshold for aggression, they may provide the energy for a fight, but they do not, it seems, write the script. They are the current in a river, powerful and undeniable, but the riverbank, shaped by upbringing, culture, conscience, and choice, is what ultimately determines its course. So, if the river runs fast, do we blame the water or the shape of the land that guides it? This brings us to a final, unsettling contemplation. If our own bodies possess a latent tendency to chemically reward acts of dominance and cruelty, what happens when such a body is placed in an environment that doesn't just permit violence, but actively encourages it? What happens when the riverbank is carved to channel the current toward a waterfall? The internal politics of testosterone and cortisol, the ancient dance between the urge to dominate and the instinct to submit, is not played out in a vacuum. It is amplified or muted by the world we inhabit. The real question, then, may not be about the nature of the hormone, but about the nature of the world we build around the human being who carries it. If a single human, armed with these primal urges, can be both a killer and a champion, what becomes possible when millions of such humans are organized into a single, purpose-driven machine? It seems counterintuitive, almost a flaw in the logic of nature. The solitary tiger, a perfect killing machine, prowls its vast territory alone. Its violence is a matter of survival, a stark and singular act. Yet, statistically, the tiger is less likely to kill its own kind than the chimpanzee, a creature of complex social bonds who grooms its friends and shares food. Or the dolphin, that smiling emblem of intelligence, known to form gangs that ruthlessly batter and drown rivals. Here lies the paradox. The more social the animal, the more sophisticated its community, the higher the rate of lethal violence within its own species. So, what happens when the ultimate social animal, the human being, builds not just tribes, but cities, nations, and global empires? Does the very machinery of our cooperation contain, within its intricate gears, a more efficient engine for cruelty? Consider first the biological cradle, the deep, genetic roots of our togetherness. We are wired for connection. Molecules like oxytocin flood our systems during moments of intimacy, when we hug a loved one or share a laugh with a friend. This bonding hormone is the chemical signature of trust, the glue that holds families and communities together. But this glue has a dark, adhesive property. It not only strengthens the bonds within the group, it sharpens the boundary that defines who is outside of it. The same neurochemical system that fosters nurturing care and fierce loyalty to one's own can, in a different context, amplify suspicion, prejudice, and even hatred toward the other. It is a biological seesaw. The capacity for profound empathy seems to be yoked to the capacity for targeted antipathy. Is our greatest strength our ability to stand together inextricably linked to our readiness to stand against someone else? This biological predisposition did not vanish as we moved from forest to forum. It was built upon, institutionalized, and given a grand stage. The archaeological record is not merely a collection of tools and pottery. It is a chronicle of socially sanctioned violence. The grand ziggurats of Mesopotamia, the soaring pyramids of the Maya, the imposing walls of Assyria, these were the epicenters of complex, stratified societies. And etched into their stones, woven into their art, are scenes that chill the modern soul. Prisoners of war, their heads held aloft by triumphant kings, captives, their hearts offered to the gods by priestly hands. Intricate hierarchies where the roles of executioner and victim were as clearly defined as those of farmer and scribe. This was not the chaotic violence of a barroom brawl. This was violence as a pillar of social order, a terrifyingly organized spectacle designed to reinforce power, appease deities, and unite the populace through a shared, brutal ritual. The club had been replaced by the altar, and the act of killing had been given a meaning that transcended the individual. If civilization is the process of taming the wild, why did it so often involve perfecting the art of the slaughter? The machinery of modern society, for all its gleaming technology and enlightened laws, has not shed this ancient blueprint. It has merely refined it. Look at the sterile efficiency of a military operation, the rigid hierarchy of a corporation, the dehumanizing structure of a prison. In these environments, violence is rarely the product of a single, rage-filled individual. It emerges from a system. A person is not a monster. They are a soldier following orders, a guard enforcing rules, a manager meeting a quarterly target. The act is broken down into 1,000 small, manageable tasks, each one seemingly innocuous, each one performed by someone who is, in their own mind, just doing their job. The social structure provides a shield, a diffusion of responsibility that allows ordinary people to participate in extraordinary cruelty. The violence becomes procedural, a matter of paperwork and protocol. Does the uniform we wear, whether of cloth or of corporate policy, not only empower us to act but also absolve us from feeling? Of course, this is only one side of the coin. To speak only of this is to tell a lie of omission. For the very same social organization that can orchestrate a genocide is also the force that builds hospitals, funds scientific research, and creates vast networks of charity. It gives us the rule of law to protect the weak, and the concept of human rights to elevate our collective conscience. This is the glorious counter-narrative, the evidence of our moral progress. Our interconnectedness is the reason a child in one country can be saved by a vaccine developed in another. Our complex societies allow for the accumulation and sharing of knowledge, for art and philosophy to flourish. The same impulse that builds an army to destroy can build a community to heal. So, is the story of human society one of ascending morality, a slow but steady triumph of our better angels? Perhaps that is the wrong question to ask. Perhaps the more unsettling inquiry is not whether we are good or evil, but how the same intricate social machine can be so breathtakingly creative and so systematically destructive. How can the same species that composes a symphony also design a concentration camp? The structures of our togetherness are neutral, a powerful, amplifying force. They do not create the impulse for kindness or cruelty. They merely provide the means to enact it on a scale unimaginable to the solitary tiger. The bond that cradles can also become the weapon that clubs. And so we are left not with an answer, but with a deeper, more haunting mystery. If our social nature is the source of both our salvation and our damnation, what is the trigger that decides which path we take? This leads us to a more primal frontier, a shadow that falls across both the lone hunter and the bustling city. If the group provides the machinery for violence, what is the ancient, territorial spark that first ignites the engine? What deep-seated biological reaction, shared from the tiger in its jungle to the CEO in his skyscraper, makes us so ready to take from others in order to claim something as our own? The heat was a physical presence in the Brazilian state of Pará in 2019, a heavy blanket pressing down on the red earth. On a piece of land, its legal status a tangled, unresolved knot, a man took a step. It was just a step, onto soil he may have believed was his, or perhaps simply land he needed. Another man saw that step not as a movement, but as a violation. There was no long-standing feud, no personal hatred exchanged in the moments before. The trigger was simpler, more primal, an intrusion. A life was extinguished for the crime of crossing an invisible line. This is not a story of unique evil, but a stark modern enactment of an ancient script written deep within the biology of life on Earth. It forces a question that echoes from the densest jungles to the most polished courtrooms. What biological reaction, what deep-seated wiring, makes us so ready to seize, to defend, to kill, for the concept of territory? Beneath the complex veneer of human law and custom, an older chemistry is at work. In the shadowed undergrowth of a Sumatran rainforest, a male tiger patrols the boundaries of his domain. His scent marks a pungent, invisible fence. His vigilance, his readiness for explosive violence, is fueled by a cascade of neurochemicals. Central among them is a simple molecule, vasopressin. This hormone, acting as both a messenger and a modulator in the brain, is intricately linked to territorial defense across a vast spectrum of species. It sharpens aggression, hardens the resolve to stand one's ground. We, humans, share this very same system. The same neural pathways that light up in the brain of a defending animal when a rival approaches its nest or its hunting grounds are the ones that flicker within us when a stranger lingers too long at our garden fence, when a neighbor disputes a property line, or when we feel the intangible borders of our social group are being breached. The house is our den, the nation our pack's range. The feeling of possessive unease, the quickening pulse at an unexpected knock on the door, is this the ghost of vasopressin, whispering its ancient warnings in the modern mind, a biological cradle for the club we so often wield? This impulse to mark and defend did not begin with deeds and titles. Long before the first legal document was inked, our ancestors were etching their claims into the very earth. Consider the ancient settlement of Jericho, a sprawling Stone Age town rising from the Jordan Valley. Its most striking feature, even today, is not its homes but its defenses. A massive stone wall, a towering feat of communal labor, and a deep, rock-cut moat. A few hundred miles and centuries away, the inhabitants of Çatalhöyük built a different kind of fortress, a dense, honeycombed city, where houses shared walls, and entry was gained through holes in the roof. These were not random architectural choices. They were the physical manifestation of a profound shift in the human story, the transition from nomadic wandering to settled agriculture. With the investment of sowing seeds and waiting for harvests came a new, unbreakable bond to a specific piece of land. The land was no longer just a temporary camp. It was identity, it was larder, it was future. And with that bond came a predictable shadow, a dramatic increase in organized territorial violence. The wall was both a shield and a statement, a declaration that this is us and that is you. But in drawing that line so permanently in stone, did we merely protect ourselves, or did we also institutionalize the very concept of the other against whom violence becomes permissible? This ancient legacy courses through the veins of our modern world, amplified to a terrifying scale. The same instinct that compels a songbird to drive a rival from its tree manifests in the geopolitical theater as nations mobilizing armies over a disputed border. The farmer in a remote village who kills a neighbor over a hand's breadth of soil is acting on the same foundational anxiety as the general who draws red lines on a map, lines that, if crossed, could mean annihilation. For humans, territory has become a vessel for everything we are and everything we fear. It is imbued with notions of power, a direct measure of influence and control. It is entangled with personal and national identity. The soil of the homeland is sacred. The plot of land is a testament to a family's history. And when that identity feels threatened, the biological response, filtered through the lens of culture and ideology, becomes something far more potent and destructive than the simple territorial aggression of an animal. We don't just fight for resources. We fight for an idea of ourselves that is inextricably linked to a place. The ferocity of our territorial disputes, then, not a remnant of our animal past, but rather the horrifying result of having layered immense psychological and symbolic meaning onto a primitive biological trigger. A skeptic might interject here, pointing to the natural world's own brutal ledger. After all, the tiger does not merely warn, he kills. A rival male, if he encroaches, will be met with tooth and claw until one is dead or driven away. The evidence is clear. Animals slaughter each other for territory, for the resources and reproductive rights it guarantees. So, are we not simply acting out a similar, instinctual playbook? Is the man in Brazil and the tiger in Sumatra merely two variations on a single, ruthless theme of survival, two different instruments playing the same evolutionary tune? Yet, there is a profound divergence in the score. The tiger kills to hold his forest. He does not draw a map of the forest, imbue it with sacred meaning, and pass it to his sons as a divine inheritance. He does not sew a flag with the image of a tree and rally other tigers to die for that symbol. He does not invent a philosophy that justifies the extermination of another tiger clan because their presence on the opposite bank of a river is an existential threat to his way of life. Humans do. We are the creatures who transform the biological impulse into a creed. We build flagpoles and write atlases. We narrate epic poems about blood and soil and wage wars in the name of the fatherland. We have taken the simple, brutal logic of the jungle and elevated it into an ideology, a cause for which we are willing to sacrifice not just our lives, but our humanity. The territorial instinct may be the shared foundation, but have we, in our profound capacity for abstraction and symbolism, built a uniquely monstrous edifice upon it? We carved the club from the cradle, but then we forged it in the fires of ideology and gilded it with gods. So is the true territory we are, defending now not the land itself, but the stories we tell about it. And if this deep-seated drive to possess and exclude is so fundamental to our nature, what does that mean for our equally lauded capacity for empathy? If the same evolutionary forces that shaped our territorial rage also sculpted our ability to feel for one another, then when does the circuit of compassion fail? When does the border we draw around our own group, be it family, tribe, or nation, become a wall so high that the cries on the other side become mere noise? Does the survival of the fiercest sometimes depend on a selective shutting down of the heart? The choice is presented on a screen, clean and digital, a sterile interface for a deeply human dilemma. A runaway trolley is careening down the tracks. On one branch, 5 people are tied down. On the other, a single individual. The lever is in your hand. Most participants, when the single person is a stranger, pull the lever without much hesitation. The math is simple. 5 lives outweigh 1. It is a logical, almost clinical act of utilitarian calculus. But then, the scenario shifts. The single person on the track is given a name, a face. They are your friend, your parent, your child. Suddenly, the hand freezes. The lever becomes impossibly heavy. The mind, so capable of cold calculation just moments before, now rebels. The reason, when voiced, is often a quiet, gut-wrenching confession. I just couldn't. The math hasn't changed. The logic remains pristine. But something else has intervened. Something that short-circuits the neat equations of morality. It is the visceral, non-negotiable pull of connection. It is the failure, or perhaps the refusal, to feel for the abstract statistic. It is the selective nature of empathy in its rawest, most undeniable form. This is not a flaw in our moral software, but a feature written deep into our biological code. Empathy, it turns out, is not a universal, all-encompassing instinct. It is a resource. And like any precious resource in the economy of survival, it is allocated strategically. Biologists and geneticists point to a mechanism known as in-group favoritism. Our capacity for profound feeling did not evolve to embrace the entirety of the world, but to ensure the survival of a much smaller circle: our kin, our tribe, those who share our genes and our fate. This is not a conscious choice, but an ancient, hardwired impulse. To feel the pain of your child as acutely as your own, to share the joy of your hunting partner, to mourn the loss of a clan member, these bonds forged in the fires of mutual dependence. They are the social glue that held our ancestors together. The emotional energy required to genuinely care is immense. To expend it indiscriminately on every being we encounter would be neurologically profligate, a fast track to burnout and paralysis. So, the gates of our hearts are not thrown open to all. They are guarded, opening widest for those who look like us, sound like us, and whose survival is inextricably linked to our own. Is this not the ultimate genetic pragmatism, a way to ensure that our own lineage, our own unique strand of code, finds its way into the future? This biological bias did not remain confined to small bands of hunter-gatherers. It scaled up, becoming the silent architect of empires. The great civilizations we often look to as the cradles of philosophy and democracy, ancient Greece and Rome, were built on a foundation of institutionalized empathy deficit. Their glorious forums and soaring aqueducts were underwritten by the labor of slaves, who were systematically classified as something less than human. They were barbaroi to the Greeks, those who babbled in unintelligible tongues. They were instrumentum vocal, talking tools, to the Romans. This was not an accidental oversight, but a necessary cognitive framework. To subject another human being to the brutalities of slavery, to the whims of the arena, required a profound act of dehumanization. The empathy that flowed so freely within the in-group of citizens had to be surgically excised when it came to the out-group. The violence inflicted was not seen as cruelty, but as a simple fact of the social order, as natural as the changing of the seasons. The capacity for systematic brutality, then, is not an aberration in human history, but a recurring theme, a dark potential that is unlocked the moment we successfully redraw the boundaries of who qualifies for our compassion. If we can strip a person of their story, their pain, their humanity, what remains is merely an object, and objects can be broken without moral consequence. How thin is the veneer of civilization when it is polished by hands that refuse to feel? One might assume that such stark divisions belong to a more primitive past, that we, in our enlightened modern era, have outgrown these ancient prejudices. Yet, the evidence whispers a different, more unsettling story. The same psychological machinery that allowed a Roman to ignore the suffering of his slave is at work in the modern soldier, desensitized to the enemy, in the corporate executive, insulated from the consequences of their decisions on distant communities, in the bystander who scrolls past images of a foreign disaster. We are not universally empathetic beings. The value of a human life is not an absolute, fixed number in some grand cosmic ledger. It is a variable, its weight determined by its emotional proximity to us. A single death in our family can paralyze us with grief, while 1,000 deaths in a faraway country becomes a statistic, a fleeting headline we acknowledge with a sigh before moving on with our day. Our moral universe is not a perfect sphere of equal concern, but a series of concentric circles, with the light of our empathy brightest at the center and fading into darkness at the periphery. We have constructed vast, complex societies, yet we still navigate them with a tribal heart. Does our technology outpace our biology, leaving us with Stone Age emotions in a digital age world? And yet, here lies the profound paradox of our species. For we are also the only creatures on Earth who are capable of feeling pity for a defeated foe, of risking our own lives to rescue a stranger from a burning building, of donating our resources to alleviate suffering on the other side of the globe. We are the animal that creates hospitals for wounded enemies and charities for unknown children. This is not a behavior explained by simple in-group genetics. It is something else, a fragile, blossoming capacity to extend our circle of concern. Perhaps this is the next, tentative step in our evolution. Not a physical evolution, but a moral and cognitive one. We are learning, painstakingly, to use our powerful brains to override our ancient instincts, to grant the status of person to those who are unlike us. We are building philosophies and religions and legal systems based on the radical idea of universal human dignity. But this expansion is a choice, a conscious effort. It is a garden we must tend daily, for the default setting of the wilderness is to care only for our own. So, if empathy is not an immutable force of nature but a selective, often withheld capacity, what does it mean for our future if we, as a society, collectively choose not to feel? This question hangs in the air, leading us to a darker, more specific inquiry. For this selective empathy is not merely a passive state of indifference, it can be the active engine of unimaginable cruelty. We see its shadow in our closest genetic relatives. A troop of chimpanzees may engage in a violent, lethal border raid, a brutal display of intergroup conflict. But their violence, while shocking, lacks a certain chilling dimension. It is the difference between a sudden, explosive fight and a cold, calculated interrogation. One is an act of raw, immediate power. The other is a deliberate process, a theater of pain designed not just to harm, but to break a mind. What strange evolutionary path did we walk down that led only one species, Homo sapiens, to develop the peculiar, systematic, and sustained practice of torture? What alchemy of brain, society, and selective feeling transformed a simple capacity for cruelty into a refined, almost artistic, form of suffering? The lion brings down the gazelle, its powerful jaws closing around the windpipe. The act is swift, brutal, and final. It is a transaction of pure necessity, a transfer of energy from one body to another. The lion eats. In the deep jungle, a troop of chimpanzees encounters a rival. The confrontation is a whirlwind of shrieks and flailing limbs. When the challenger lies still, the victors do not linger. They do not feed. They simply leave, the social order momentarily reset by the raw calculus of power. And then, there is us. We are the species that built the gallows, that heated the oil for the boot, that designed the rack to methodically dislocate joints. We are the ones who looked upon the infliction of suffering and gave it a name. We called it justice. This is the uniquely human face of violence. It is not the fleeting, impulsive rage of an animal, nor the functional kill of a predator. It is something else entirely, a cold, deliberate, and organized craft. Why is it that of all the beings to walk this earth, only Homo sapiens developed the capacity for systematic torture? The answer, it seems, lies not in the darkness of our hearts, but in the brilliant, terrible light of our minds. At the biological core of this paradox is a specific piece of neural architecture, the prefrontal cortex. While other animals are largely prisoners of the present, reacting to immediate threats and rewards with the ancient hardware of the limbic system, we possess a biological command center for time. This region of the brain allows us to plan, to strategize, to run complex simulations of the future in the theater of our minds. We can delay our reactions, suppressing the immediate impulse to lash out in favor of a more calculated, long-term outcome. This cognitive power is then hijacked by a primitive yet potent chemical, dopamine. This neurotransmitter, the currency of anticipation and reward, can be earned not just from food or sex, but from the successful execution of a plan. The satisfaction of a strategy unfolding perfectly, the feeling of control, the anticipation of a future reward, be it power, security, or social standing, can all be drenched in dopamine. This is the sinister alchemy. The prefrontal cortex provides the blueprint for organized, purposeful violence, and dopamine provides the motivation to see it through. It is the birthplace of cruelty as a long-term investment, a patient and calculated enterprise. We are not merely reacting to a threat, we are architecting suffering. Does this sophisticated brain, then, our greatest gift, also contain the seeds of our most refined malevolence? The archaeological record is a silent, stone-cold witness to this grim specialization. Scattered across the globe are testaments not just to killing, but to the performance of power through pain. In ancient burial pits at sites like Jebel Sahaba in Sudan, skeletons bear the marks of projectile points and blunt force trauma, suggesting not just conflict, but perhaps execution. In Kenya, the bones of the Naturuk fossils tell a story of a massacre, of individuals who were bound and bludgeoned. On the walls of Egyptian tombs and Mesopotamian ziggurats, we find not just scenes of battle, but intricate carvings of captives being beaten, humiliated, and subjected to elaborate torments. These are not the random acts of a rampaging beast. They are deliberate, communicative acts. The violence is a message, a public spectacle designed to intimidate, to control, and to solidify the authority of the ruler or the tribe. No other primate leaves behind such a curated legacy of pain. A chimpanzee may kill a rival, but it does not build a monument to the act, nor does it systematically break the fingers of its enemy to demonstrate a political point. The evidence suggests that as soon as we became truly human, we became uniquely capable of this form of violence. Is the history of civilization, then, also a history of the institutionalization of cruelty? This legacy did not fade with the ancients. It merely evolved, putting on the suit and tie of the modern state. Today, our capacity for organized violence is not hidden in pits or carved on temple walls. It is codified in law, budgeted for by governments, and administered by civil servants. The prison system, with its solitary confinement and regimented deprivations, the concentration camp, an exercise in industrial-scale dehumanization, the public execution, a ritual of death designed to reinforce the social contract through fear. These are the ultimate expressions of our evolutionary inheritance. We have not eliminated violence, we have bureaucratized it. We have built vast, complex institutions whose primary function is to inflict controlled, deliberate suffering upon individuals, and we have deemed this not only acceptable but necessary for the functioning of society. No other species on Earth has this capacity. No wolf pack has a judicial committee. No pod of orcas maintains a permanent detainment facility. We alone have mastered the art of making cruelty legal, of turning pain into policy. When suffering becomes a service provided by the state, have we perfected our control over violence, or simply sanitized it? A counter-argument whispers from the edges of this grim narrative. Perhaps this very ability to organize and codify violence is the ultimate proof of our superior control. The same prefrontal cortex that can devise a torture device can also draft the Geneva Conventions. The same impulse to dominate that built the Colosseum also built the courtroom. By creating laws, limits, and systems of accountability, have we not taken the raw, chaotic violence of the natural world and tamed it? We channel our aggressive instincts into structured competition. We replace blood feuds with legal disputes, and we grant a monopoly on legitimate force to the state, theoretically, to protect the weak from the strong. Is our institutionalization of violence not, paradoxically, the foundation of our civility? Is the hangman's noose the price we pay for the social contract? Yet, this comforting thought carries a chilling undertow, for it implies that our savagery is not a beast we have caged, but a dragon we have put on a leash and taught to follow commands. The lion kills to eat. The chimpanzee kills for status. But we, Homo sapiens we are the creatures who can inflict pain with perfect forethought, with moral justification, and on an industrial scale. We are the species that can look into the eyes of another, recognize their shared humanity, and then, with calm deliberation, begin to break them, piece by piece, for a cause, for a god, or for order. Our violence is not less for being organized, it is infinitely more terrible. The club in the hand of a hominid is a tool. The systematic torture chamber is a masterpiece. So, we are left with a question that hangs in the air, as unsettling as the silence after a scream. Does our unparalleled capacity for organization make us the most civilized species on the planet, or simply the most terrifying? And if this is our legacy, then what are we to make of the quiet, sun-bleached bones at a place called Nataruk, where the story of organized human conflict may have written its very first, bloody chapter 10,000 years ago? The wind whispers across the flat, sun-baked earth of Turkana, Kenya, carrying with it the dust of millennia. It is a dry, ancient sound, but if you listen closely, with the ears of an archaeologist, you can almost hear the other sounds this land has known: the lap of a receding lake shore, the calls of hunter-gatherers, and finally, the sickening crack of a skull being shattered. Here, at a place called Nataruk, time has frozen a single, brutal day from 10,000 years ago. A pregnant woman, her knees drawn up as if in a final, futile act of protection, lies where she fell. A blow to her head ended 2 lives at once. Nearby, the skeletons of men tell a darker story still. Their hands appear to have been bound, their bodies pierced by stone-tipped projectiles. This was not a random act of violence. This was a coordinated attack, a massacre. Nataruk stands as a stark, silent monument to a profoundly unsettling idea that war is not a modern invention, not a byproduct of agriculture, property, or government. It is a ghost, a deeply embedded instinct that has walked with us from the very beginning. What is it, deep within our own biology, that allows a group of individuals to coalesce into a we so powerful that a they becomes a target? The roots of this division are not buried in history books, but in the very fabric of our being. Long before we built walls around our cities, we built invisible walls around our tribes. Our evolutionary journey favored a powerful double-edged trait, an unparalleled capacity for cooperation within our group, paired with a sharp, instinctual wariness of those outside it. This is the cradle and the club, born from the same wood. Our brains are wired for this. The feeling of belonging, of shared purpose and shared triumph, is chemically rewarded. When our group succeeds, a delicate cocktail of neurotransmitters, including dopamine, floods our system, reinforcing the behavior that led to the victory. It feels good to win together. This same neurological circuitry, which once motivated our ancestors to work as one to bring down a mammoth, could just as easily be activated for a raid on a neighboring band. Our genes, in their relentless quest for propagation, encourage this duality, fostering profound loyalty and altruism towards our own, while simultaneously priming us for suspicion and competition against outsiders. This is the primordial soil from which the tree of organized conflict grows. Is the very thing that allowed us to build communities also the flaw that destined us to destroy them? Nataruk is the chilling physical proof that this biological potential was realized long before what we consider civilization began. This site, dating back to the twilight of the Pleistocene, dismantles a comforting narrative. We once imagined that war was born with the first king, the first grain silo, the first deed to a piece of land. We thought it was a social disease, a symptom of having too much to lose. Nataruk tells a different story. These people were hunter-gatherers, living a nomadic life around the fertile edges of a vast lake. They had no permanent structures, no accumulated wealth, no formal hierarchy. Yet, the evidence speaks of something far more calculated than a spontaneous brawl. The projectile points embedded in bone, the strategic positioning of the attackers, the bound hands of the victims. This was tactics. This was organized killing. It was not a skirmish over a personal insult. It was a collective action, a deliberate and violent encounter between two groups. It suggests that the capacity for what we would call warfare planned, group-on-group lethal aggression was a tool in our toolkit long before we settled down. If this is true, then the seeds of mass conflict were sown not in the fields of Jericho, but in the much older, wilder grasslands of our ancestral home. Does this mean that the transition from nomadic bands to settled societies did not create war, but merely gave it more to fight over? Look around at the conflicts that scar our modern world, from the trenches of Eastern Europe to the ancient lands of the Middle East. The technologies have changed beyond our ancestors' wildest dreams. The spears have been replaced by drones, the shouted war cries by ideological manifestos broadcast across the globe. Yet, if you strip away the veneer of modernity, the core engines of conflict remain hauntingly familiar. They are still, at their heart, about territory, the control of land, of borders, of strategic corridors. They are about resources, the oil beneath the sand, the water in the rivers, the minerals in the hills. And most powerfully, they are about identity, the fierce, often unshakable belief in the supremacy of one's own group, one's own nation, one's own creed. The us versus them dichotomy, so deeply etched into our neurobiology, is now amplified by flags, religions, and political systems. The dopamine hit of collective victory is now channeled through nationalistic fervor and the euphoria of a military parade. The story of Nataruk is not an ancient relic, it is a prelude. It is the first, brutal chapter of a story we are still writing. Have we truly evolved beyond our origins? Or have we simply found more elaborate and devastating ways to perform the same old rituals of dominance and defense? Yet, a cautious voice urges us to pause. Could Nataruk be the exception, not the rule? Perhaps this single brutal event is an outlier, a grisly anomaly in a prehistory that was, for the most part, characterized by peaceful coexistence between small, scattered bands. After all, for cooperation to be so deeply ingrained in our nature, the day-to-day reality for our ancestors must have been largely cooperative, both within and between groups. There is evidence of trade, of intermarriage, of shared cultural practices over wide areas. The archaeological record is not a continuous chronicle of massacre sites. It is mostly one of stone tools, hearths, and the quiet accumulation of daily life. Maybe the default state of humanity is not war, but a fragile peace, punctuated by occasional, catastrophic bursts of violence when resources become desperately scarce or when social tensions snap. Perhaps Nataruk represents a bad day, a perfect storm of drought, competition, and fear, rather than a universal truth about the human condition. If we focus only on the scars, do we risk missing the larger, more peaceful body of our shared history? This leaves us not with an answer, but with a heavier, more persistent question. If the propensity for organized, group-level violence is woven into the very strands of our DNA, a demon born from the same evolutionary pressures that gave us empathy and cooperation, then what hope is there for a lasting peace? Can we ever truly excise this instinct, or is our entire civilizing project merely an attempt to manage it, to sanitize it, to channel it into less overtly destructive forms? We have created international laws, global institutions, and complex economies of mutual dependence, all in an effort to cage the beast. But the beast is not outside of us, it is us. It is the same force that drives a team to victory and a nation to war, the club and the cradle, forever linked. As we stand here, 10,000 years after the massacre at Nataruk, looking out at a world still gripped by the same fundamental conflicts, we are left to wonder, are we building a world that transcends our nature, or just one that hides it more effectively? And if this brutality is our inheritance, then what does that make our progress? A rock, once? That was all it took. A single, heavy stone, clutched in a hand fueled by rage or fear, could end a life. The act was intimate, visceral. You felt the impact travel up your arm. You saw the light fade from the eyes. Today, a click. A silent, sterile input from a console half a world away, and a village disappears in a bloom of fire and dust, observed through a screen that reduces screams to data points. The question then isn't whether we have become more cruel, but whether our evolution has been a journey toward greater humanity, or simply a masterclass in the engineering of cruelty. Have we, in our ascent, not learned to be kinder, but only to be cruel with breathtaking efficiency. Consider the human brain, that 3-pound universe. It is a biological anomaly, a structure that developed a prefrontal cortex capable of projecting itself through time. We can plan for a future harvest, and we can plan a siege. We can imagine the joy of a child, and we can imagine the cascading consequences of a well-placed lie. This same faculty allows for a profound and terrifying separation. The act of causing harm can be neatly severed from the immediate emotional experience of it. The neural pathways that fire when we clutch that rock, pathways of adrenaline and gut-wrenching immediacy, are silenced. In their place, a cool, cognitive process unfolds. The brain, in its magnificent complexity, may have accidentally built a disconnect between doing harm and feeling the weight of it. Is our capacity for detached violence, then, not a moral failing, but a chilling byproduct of a brain that learned to think too far ahead? A tool that, in its very design, contains the blueprint for its own potential for cruelty? This cognitive shift left its fingerprints all over our history, etched not in stone tablets but in the very tools we crafted. The archaeological record is a museum of our escalating ingenuity, from the sharpened flint, a tool that extended our reach and made hunting possible, to the polished obsidian blade that could cleanly slit a throat. Each leap in metallurgy, in physics, in chemistry, was mirrored by a parallel evolution in the art of destruction. The medieval torture rack was a masterpiece of biomechanical understanding, its levers and cogs designed to maximize agony without ending life prematurely. The guillotine was introduced as a humane, egalitarian advance, a swift, democratic end. And then, the gas chamber, the concentration camp. These were not eruptions of primal chaos. They were the opposite. They were masterpieces of logistics, of bureaucracy, of cold, systematic optimization. The cruelty did not vanish. It was streamlined, industrialized, made more cost-effective. Does the progression from club to chemical weapon suggest that our drive to improve our world is inextricably and darkly twinned with our drive to improve our methods of unmaking it? This industrialization of harm finds its ultimate expression in our modern societal structures. We have built systems so vast and so specialized that the individual is insulated from the final, terrible product of their labor or their vote. A soldier piloting a drone from a base in Nevada is separated from the reality of his actions by thousands of miles, a screen, and a psychological chasm. The decision to deploy force is made by politicians in secure rooms, far from the sound of weeping. The weapons are built by engineers and technicians who see only lines of code and schematics. The violence is professionalized, its emotional cost distributed and diluted across an entire chain of command until no single person feels its full crushing weight. We have created a society where one can be a cog in the machine of death without ever getting blood on their hands, without ever having to look into the eyes of the other. In fragmenting the act of killing, have we not simply made it easier for the human conscience to sleep at night? And yet, a counter-narrative whispers through the ages, growing louder with time. This same progressive arc that gave us the machine gun also gave us the Geneva Conventions. The same interconnected world that allows for remote warfare also allows for global human rights movements and instantaneous humanitarian aid. Our heightened capacity for empathy, our philosophical debates on ethics, our legal frameworks designed to protect the vulnerable, are these not also products of our evolved minds? Perhaps this is not a simple story of descent, but a constant, agonizing tension. The same cognitive light that allows us to design a more efficient sword also allows us to conceive of a universal right to life. Is the story of humanity, then, the story of our cruelty slowly being cornered, challenged, and contained by the very intellect that first empowered it? But this hopeful thought casts a long, troubling shadow. For these two strands, the humanitarian and the destructive, do not exist in separate realms. They are woven together in a single, tangled thread. The most advanced medical technologies often emerge from military research. The global communication networks that spread messages of peace are the same ones used for surveillance and control. We have learned to gild our violence, to wrap it in the language of justice, security, and progress. We have not eliminated the predator within, we have simply taught it to wear a suit, to speak in press conferences, to operate within the bounds of international law. The fundamental capacity remains, polished and refined. If our greatest moral and technological achievements can coexist so comfortably with our most efficient tools for annihilation, have we truly progressed, or have we merely become more sophisticated apes, learning to sugarcoat the poison rather than developing an antidote? This leaves us not with an answer, but with a deeper, more unsettling question, one that slithers into the quiet spaces of our mind. If our intelligence is the source of both our salvation and our potential self-destruction, then what does it mean that we are the only species on this planet that systematically, deliberately, and inventively orchestrates the mass extinction of its own kind? A wolf will never seek to eradicate an entire species because of the color of its fur. It hunts for survival, for territory, for the pack. Its violence is a tool, sharp and finite, but humanity has done this very thing. We have looked upon our own kind, marked them as fundamentally times other asterisk, and orchestrated their annihilation. The Holocaust, Rwanda, Armenia, these are not the brutal, instinctive clashes of the animal kingdom. They are something else entirely, a chillingly human invention. They force a question that echoes through the quiet of history. Why is it that no other creature, save for us, has ever conceived of, let alone executed, the genocide of its own species? The answer may be buried deep within our own biology, in the very instincts that once guaranteed our survival. Our distant ancestors lived in a world of immediate threats and scarce resources. In that world, the ability to quickly distinguish us from them was not a prejudice, it was a vital alarm system. The stranger, the one who spoke with an unfamiliar cadence or bore different markings, was a potential carrier of disease, a competitor for food, a danger to the tribe. This tribal wiring, this innate suspicion of the outsider, is an ancient inheritance. It is a thread of fear woven into the fabric of our being, a reflex that once kept us safe within the firelight's glow. Yet, this same instinct, when placed in the crucible of the human mind, undergoes a terrifying transformation. We are not merely creatures of instinct, we are creatures of imagination. We can conceptualize a future without a rival. We can weave narratives of purity and contamination. We can broadcast an idea, a hatred, a fear, until it becomes a shared truth for millions. The primal flinch of them is no longer a personal caution. It becomes a collective weapon, a story so potent it can arm a population and aim it at its own reflection. The club that was meant to defend the cradle has been reforged in the fires of ideology, but is the hand that holds it still the same? If we dig into the layers of our past, the archaeological record offers a silent, sobering testimony. There is no evidence that Neanderthals, or any of our other hominin cousins, engaged in systematic, ideologically driven extermination. Their conflicts, like those of wolves, were likely over resources, over land, a brutal but contained calculus of survival. The shift appears to have arrived with us, Homo sapiens and our unique capacity for culture. When we transitioned from nomadic bands to settled agricultural societies, we built more than just granaries and walls. We constructed powerful, defining group identities. The land was no longer just a place to roam. It was our times land. The gods were no longer spirits of the forest. They were our times gods. With this ownership came a new kind of border, not just geographical but existential. The other was no longer just a competitor. They were a blasphemy, a stain on the sacred order of things. The first evidence of mass killings, entire villages put to the sword, populations displaced and erased, coincides with this consolidation of us. We began to see ourselves not just as a tribe, but as an idea, and ideas, it seems, demand a purity that nature never intended. Could it be that our greatest achievements, culture, agriculture, civilization, unwittingly forged the very tools of our own potential self-destruction? This ancient potential finds its most horrifyingly efficient expression in the modern world. The totalitarian regimes of the 20th and 21st centuries did not invent dehumanization. They industrialized it. They understood the human psyche with a surgeon's cold precision. To make genocide palatable, even desirable, you must first sever the target from the circle of shared humanity. Language becomes the primary scalpel. A people are not a people. They are vermin, cockroaches, a virus. These are not mere metaphors, they are cognitive poison. They reduce complex human beings with loves, fears, and histories to the status of a pestilence, an infestation to be cleansed. This linguistic alchemy makes the unthinkable manageable. You do not feel guilt for exterminating a rat. You feel a sense of hygiene. The propaganda machine, a far cry from the campfire stories of old, amplifies this narrative until it drowns out all others, until neighbor turns against neighbor, seeing not a childhood friend but a carrier of the plague. The violence that follows is not a frenzied riot. It is often a cold, administrative process, a bureaucracy of death. Is the most terrifying monster not the one that rages, but the one that files the paperwork? And yet, within this bleak portrait of our nature, a counter-narrative stubbornly persists. The same species that engineered the death camps also built the museums to memorialize their victims. The same minds that devised racist ideologies also conceived of international courts and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We etch the names of the lost into stone. We teach the horrors in our schools. We swear never again, with a solemnity that feels like a prayer. This is not an insignificant impulse. It is a conscious, arduous effort to rewire our own instincts, to build systems of empathy that can override the ancient fear of the other. We are, it seems, a species in a constant state of struggle with itself, capable of reaching for the stars with one hand while clutching a knife for our own throat with the other. But does the act of remembrance truly inoculate us against the poison of hatred, or does it merely document the symptoms of a recurring disease? Perhaps. But the most unsettling truth lies not in our capacity for evil, but in our capacity to justify it. Each genocide, each act of mass annihilation, was not committed by cackling villains in a vacuum. It was perpetrated by ordinary people, farmers, teachers, clerks, who had been convinced it was necessary, logical, even righteous. It was framed as a defense of the nation, a purification of the race, a necessary step toward a utopian future. The machinery of genocide is always greased with the oil of reason. So, if the impulse is ancient and the justifications are endlessly renewable, what, then, is the fragile barrier that stands between our civilized present and a barbaric future? What is the true nature of the peace we have built, and upon what foundations does it really rest? Could it be that this very peace, this order we cherish, was itself forged in the very fires we so desperately fear? When the first tribe raised a stone pillar, it was not to worship a god, but to execute a traitor. Could it be that civilization did not begin with light, but with blood? This is not the story we prefer to tell ourselves. We imagine the dawn of society as a gathering around a fire, the sharing of a meal, the birth of language and art. Yet, perhaps huddled in that same circle of firelight, casting long, dancing shadows, was another, more primal understanding. The understanding of fear. The fear of the one who breaks the pact, the fear of chaos, the fear of pain and death. This is the unspoken foundation, the dark sub-basement upon which the gleaming structures of order were later built. It is a story written not in ink, but in the indelible language of the human nervous system, a script we have been reading and reacting to for millennia. Deep within the temporal lobe of every human brain, two almond-shaped clusters of neurons, the amygdalae, stand as ancient sentinels. Long before the first word was spoken or the first law was carved, these structures were the command center for survival. Their primary language is not reason, but raw, electric fear. When confronted with a threat, they bypass the slow, deliberative cortex and scream directly into the body. Asterisk, fight, flee, freeze. Asterisk. This is the bedrock of the avoid pain reflex, a biological imperative so powerful it can override almost every other thought. It is this very wiring that makes the human animal so exquisitely susceptible to control through violence. The threat of pain, or its ultimate expression in death, is not just a persuasive argument. It is a key that turns in a lock buried deep within our evolutionary past. To obey the one who holds the club is not necessarily an act of respect or even agreement. It is, at its most fundamental level, an act of neural programming, a desperate, instinctual bid to silence the amygdala's alarm. The authority of the first chieftain, then, may have been less about charisma and more about who could most convincingly embody that threat, who could become, in the eyes of the tribe, the living personification of the consequences of disobedience. Is our submission to power, then, merely the civilized echo of a prey animal's flinch? This biological truth found its perfect expression in the birth of the first empires. The Assyrians, masters of the ancient Near East, did not hide their methods. They carved them into palace walls for all to see. Reliefs depict prisoners being flayed alive, impaled on stakes, their tongues torn out, a grim public spectacle designed not just to punish, but to broadcast a message. The message was not subtle. This is the price of defiance. It was a theater of cruelty where the state was the director, the executioner, the lead actor, and the populace, a captive audience whose amygdalae were the intended target. Centuries earlier, the Code of Hammurabi, often hailed as a landmark of legal progress, was itself underwritten by this logic. An eye for an eye is not merely a principle of proportional justice, it is a stark, visceral equation of pain. The law, inscribed on a towering stele, was a permanent, unyielding monument to the idea that social order is maintained by the credible promise of sanctioned violence. The grand ziggurats and orderly city-states of Mesopotamia did not rise in a vacuum. They were built on a foundation of fear, their bricks mortared with the terror of public execution. Can a stable society truly be woven from threads of dread, or does the fabric forever retain the stain of its bloody origins? This ancient calculus of control did not vanish with the fall of empires. It simply evolved, putting on the suit and tie of the modern state. Today, we have sanitized the spectacle. The public flaying is replaced by the court summons, the executioner's axe by the police baton, the imperial decree by the legal statute. Yet, the underlying mechanism remains eerily familiar. The state, by definition, holds a monopoly on the legitimate use of violence. This is not an abstract political theory. It is a daily reality. The armed police officer on the street corner, the prison cell, the threat of a fine or seizure of property, these are all modern manifestations of the same primal tool. When a crowd of protesters disperses at the sight of a riot line, is it always a collective, reasoned agreement with the law? Or is it more often the quiet, instinctual calculation of the avoid pain reflex, the amygdala recognizing the potential for harm and urging retreat? Our compliance is often less about an internalized respect for the rules and more about a deeply ingrained biological fear of the consequences. We have traded the blood-soaked altar for the sterile courtroom, but has the heartbeat of control truly changed? Yet, to cast fear solely as a tyrant's tool is to see only half the picture. There is a paradoxical, almost alchemical, transformation that occurs when individual fear is harnessed by the collective. The same terror that makes a person bow to a despot might also be the force that prevents them from stealing a neighbor's harvest, or breaking a peace treaty, or committing murder in the dark of night. In this light, fear becomes the reluctant midwife of law and cooperation. The dread of communal punishment, of being cast out from the protective circle of the tribe, forges the first fragile social contracts. It is the pressure that turns the chaotic carbon of individual impulse into the ordered crystal of social structure. Without this external discipline, this shared understanding of dire consequences, could the intricate, interdependent machine of civilization have ever sputtered to life? Is the shadow of the executioner's blade not only a threat to the individual, but also, perversely, a shield for the group? Perhaps. The evidence seems to lean in that direction, suggesting that the cradle of civilization was also, in part, a crucible of controlled terror. But if this is true, if our cities and laws and arts are indeed built upon a foundation of fear, then a more unsettling question begins to form in the silence that follows. It is a question that lingers like a ghost in the machinery of the state, a question about the stability of a house built on such trembling ground. When the fear that has been directed inward, used to govern the self and the community, is finally turned outward, when the terror once aimed at the traitor is aimed at the throne, what then? Does the entire structure, deprived of its foundational pressure, simply collapse into chaos? Or does the violence, for so long the tool of order, erupt with the ferocity of a reflex no longer suppressed, revealing that the club and the cradle were, all along, carved from the very same stone? And if fear is the mortar of our social order, then why do we so often feel compelled to make a spectacle of pain? Why, from the crowded colosseums of Rome to the public square executions of the medieval era, has humanity been drawn to the theater of punishment? It is a grim fascination that seems to run counter to our empathy, a collective witnessing of suffering that is somehow meant to serve as a lesson. What deep, ancestral chord does this ritual strike? Is it simply a brutal reminder of the consequences of transgression, a way to sharpen the edge of the law in the public mind? Or does it tap into something more primal, a collective survival instinct that is somehow soothed by seeing the threat identified, contained, and violently eliminated before our very eyes? Does the public execution, in its horrifying pageantry, serve to cauterize the community's fear, transforming a diffuse anxiety into a focused and ultimately concluded narrative? The air in the medieval square is thick with the smell of roasting nuts and damp wool, a festival atmosphere. Children weave through the legs of the crowd, their laughter a stark counterpoint to the grim wooden platform at the center. A man, hollow-eyed and bound, is led up the steps. As the axe falls, a collective sound ripples through the masses, not a gasp of horror, but a roar of approval. Families had come together, not to mourn, but to witness suffering. Why does the spectacle of pain, the ritualized downfall of another, so often feel like a communal binding, a strange and terrible reassurance that the world is, for a moment, put right? Is it possible that witnessing the pain of a transgressor is a dark, ancient medicine for our collective anxiety? At its most fundamental level, this impulse might be written in the very chemistry of our brains. Neuroscientists have peered into the human mind during moments of perceived justice and found something startling. When we witness a wrongdoer being punished, a specific neural pathway can ignite, releasing a trickle of dopamine. This is not the same crude thrill of schadenfreude, but something more profound, a feeling of moral reinforcement. The brain, in its complex calculus, registers the punishment as a rebalancing of the cosmic scales. This justice-reward is a potent social glue. It tells the individual, and by extension the tribe, that the rules matter, that violations have consequences, and that your own adherence to the social contract is not in vain. It is a biological whisper from our deep past, affirming that the person who steals the meat or betrays the clan will not prosper. This neurological sigh of relief is a collective sedative, calming the fear that chaos might win. But if this feeling is so innate, so chemically rewarded, can we truly claim the moral high ground when we feel it? Are we merely responding to a primal cue, mistaking a shot of dopamine for divine justice? This biological thread is woven tightly into the tapestry of our history, a dark strand running through nearly every civilization. Public execution was not a European eccentricity. It was a global norm. In England, crowds gathered for hangings as we might for a sporting event, with vendors selling pies and souvenirs. In the ancient Middle East, the stark, communal violence of stoning ensured every hand held a stone, making every citizen complicit in the act of purification. The Maya priests, atop their pyramidal temples, would offer still-beating hearts to the gods, a spectacle of sacrifice meant to sustain the very cosmos. The goal was always twofold. Yes, it was about punishing the individual, removing a threat, but more importantly, it was a brutal form of theater for the living. It was a visceral, unforgettable lesson about the location of power. The king, the chieftain, the state demonstrated its ultimate authority over life and death, transforming abstract law into a splash of blood on the cobblestones. The suffering body became a text from which the entire community was meant to read the same lesson. This could be you. The scaffold was as much a tool of education as it was of elimination. So, were these rituals of pain merely the clumsy brutality of a less enlightened age? Or were they a sophisticated, if horrifying, technology for social cohesion? One might assume we have evolved beyond such barbarism, that the modern world has sanitized this ancient impulse. But look closer. The wooden platform has been replaced by the smartphone screen. We no longer gather in the town square to see a hanging. We gather in digital forums to watch the live-streamed downfall of a celebrity, the viral video of a bully being confronted, the meticulous public shaming of a politician or a corporate executive. We engage in cancel culture, a modern-day digital stoning where the stones are words and the crowd is global. The language has changed, but the underlying melody remains hauntingly familiar. We are still bearing witness to punishment. We still feel that same surge of vindication, that same quieting of our own fears when we see a transgressor brought low. It reinforces our shared moral boundaries and offers a potent, if fleeting, sensation of safety. We tell ourselves, see, the system works, justice is served. We watch the pain of others to feel a little more secure in our own lives. But in this translation from physical to digital, have we lost something, or have we merely made the spectacle more efficient, more pervasive, and perhaps more insidious? A necessary counter-argument arises here, a voice of cold reason. Isn't punishment essential? Without consequence, without a tangible deterrent, would society not fray at the edges and descend into disorder? The threat of pain, whether the pain of imprisonment or the pain of social ostracization, is the bedrock upon which laws are built. It is the club that guards the cradle. To remove it entirely would be a utopian fantasy, ignoring the darker shades of human nature. Discipline, the argument goes, is not the opposite of civilization. It is its prerequisite. A society that cannot punish is a society that cannot protect its members from harm. This is a compelling, logical fortress, but it forces us to confront a difficult distinction. Where does the necessary administration of justice end, and where does the primal, almost recreational, consumption of suffering begin? Is the true purpose of punishment to correct behavior and ensure safety, or is it to feed that ancient, neurological hunger for moral order, a hunger that can be sated by a public spectacle, whether on a scaffold or a screen? Perhaps. But when the pain of another becomes a form of entertainment, a public ritual that we consume with our afternoon coffee, we are compelled to look deeper. We must ask what lies beneath this deeply ingrained instinct. This collective, survival mechanism, which so effectively bonds the group and enforces its norms, might also be a smokescreen for something more unsettling. It allows us to project our own capacity for darkness onto a chosen few, whom we then cast out or destroy, purifying ourselves in the process. We watch the axe fall, or the canceling tweet go viral, and we feel clean, righteous, and safe. The crowd disperses from the square, the phone screen darkens, and we are left with a quiet, lingering unease. We have reaffirmed the rules, we have felt the rush of justice, but have we truly confronted the darkness within the crowd itself? Or have we simply found a more socially acceptable way to swing the club, all while believing we are safely nestled in the cradle? And if this is the primitive, biological script we are still following, what happens when society's complexities demand a more nuanced response than a simple verdict of pain? The document is crisp, professional, and chillingly mundane. It is filled with the sterile language of administration, logistics, transportation, resettlement. Columns of numbers, train schedules, and resource allocations are neatly typed. There are no screams, no blood, no mention of fear. This was not a plan for conquest born of rage, but a blueprint for genocide, and millions would die at the hands of men who saw themselves not as monsters, but as diligent followers of a process. This is the central, unsettling paradox of our complex societies. As our social structures grow more intricate, cruelty finds a new, more potent ally: rationalization. It learns to wear the mask of necessity, to speak the language of procedure, and to hide its face behind a mountain of paperwork. Law, war, the concentration camp, each, in its time, has been meticulously justified with its own internal reason. The club of primal violence has been replaced by the sterile cradle of bureaucracy, rocking its charges into a moral slumber. How did our pactive Liesed of the Speakeden, greatest tool for cooperation, become a weapon for annihilation? Deep within the human brain, in the ancient structures that govern our social lives, lies a powerful, evolved directive: obey the hierarchy. For millions of years, our survival depended on it. In a world of predators and scarce resources, belonging to a cohesive, structured group was a matter of life and death. The individual who questioned the alpha, who disrupted the chain of command, risked exile and almost certain death. This legacy is etched into our neural pathways. Our nervous system responds with a flush of positive reinforcement, a quieting of anxiety, a sense of purpose when we are given a clear task by a legitimate authority. It feels good to have a role, to know our place, to be a cog that fits perfectly into a larger, purposeful machine. This neurological reward is blind to the morality of the command itself. The same brain chemistry that soothes a hunter bringing food to his tribe can also soothe a clerk stamping papers that send trainloads of people to their doom. The feeling of duty fulfilled is a potent anesthetic for the conscience. Is our deepest evolutionary strength, our capacity for social cohesion, also our most profound moral vulnerability? This biological predisposition did not vanish with the advent of civilization. It was merely institutionalized. Throughout history, the most horrific massacres have rarely been the work of howling, spontaneous mobs. They have been engineered by professional, administrative machines. The Khmer Rouge did not just unleash chaos. They meticulously documented their utopian vision, creating lists and schedules for the evacuation of cities and the re-education of the populace. The Ottoman Empire's eradication of the Armenians was not a single burst of violence, but a coordinated series of deportations and executions, logged in official dispatches. The Nazi final solution was, above all, a feat of administrative planning, a triumph of logistics over morality. The violence did not spring from a place of uncontrolled fury, but was coolly calculated in meeting minutes and budget reports. The transition from a personal act of hatred to an impersonal act of policy is the moment when evil becomes scalable. When a man kills another man, it is a tragedy. When a system kills a million, it is a statistic. What does it say about our species that our greatest atrocities are so often committed, not in a fever of passion, but in the quiet, air-conditioned halls of power, by people who have simply stopped seeing human beings and started seeing problems to be solved? This mechanism is not a relic of a darker past. It is alive and well in the architecture of our modern world. Today, acts of profound cruelty are routinely disguised as procedure, policy, or following orders. An individual nested deep within a corporate or governmental organization can easily feel their personal responsibility dissolve into the collective. This is the phenomenon of the diffusion of moral responsibility. The programmer writing code for a discriminatory algorithm, the banker approving a loan scheme that will bankrupt thousands, the official enforcing a regulation that leads to suffering. None of them may feel the direct weight of the outcome. Their task is small, their focus narrow. They are responsible for their function, not for the final, monstrous sum of all the functions combined. The organization becomes a moral shield, a labyrinth where no single person can be found holding the knife, yet the body still falls. We have constructed systems so vast and compartmentalized that they allow us to commit sins for which we feel no sinfulness. In the modern world, is true evil not the roar of a monster, but the quiet hum of an efficient machine? And yet, to cast complexity itself as the villain is to ignore its other, more benevolent face. For it is this very same capacity for law and organization that has, over centuries, tamed the wild, impulsive violence of our ancestors. The same legal frameworks that can be twisted to justify oppression are also the bedrock of human rights. The same bureaucratic systems that ran concentration camps also build public health infrastructures, educate children, and provide for the elderly. A complex society is not inherently evil. It is a tool, a double-edged sword of immense power. It is the scaffold upon which we have built our cathedrals and our prisons. It is the mechanism that can both protect the vulnerable and exterminate them with equal, dispassionate efficiency. Could it be that the intricate web of our social order is not the source of the darkness, but our only fragile bulwark against an even greater, more chaotic violence waiting in the shadows? This leaves us not with an answer, but with a precipice. The gears of the modern world must turn, orders must be given and carried out, or society would grind to a halt. But when those gears are perfectly calibrated to grind human lives into data points, when the logic of the system demands the illogical sacrifice of our humanity, who is left to throw the wrench? The individual, armed with nothing but a fragile conscience, stands before the immense, impersonal momentum of the machine. The question is no longer about the nature of evil, but about the courage to interrupt a process. When a society has so perfectly rationalized cruelty into procedure, who will be the one to dare to say, simply, "This is wrong," and reach for the off switch? And if that lone voice is not enough,